Hello and welcome to this podcast from Blackwell Online. My name is George Miller, and my guest today is German historian Philipp Blom. Though the subtitle of his latest book, The Vertigo Years, Change and Culture in the West 1900 to 1914, may make it sound rather academic, it is in fact one of the most absorbing titles I've read this year. Philipp's contention is that the familiar idea that the 20th century really only started with the First World War is wrong. True, the war catalysed many phenomena, but the elements were there before the war started, if we know where to look for them. The 20th century's anxieties about sex and gender roles, its preoccupation with speed, mechanization and military power, its revolutions in the arts and sciences, its explorations of the self and challenges to old verities, all are expertly traced in this riveting history of the 20th century's first decade and a half. Not least of the pleasures of the book are the pen portraits of writers and artists, both familiar and unfamiliar, which pepper its pages. It's a book which is impossible to finish without having compiled a mental checklist of dozens more books you want to read and painters whose works you want to see. I began by asking Philipp about the difficulty of viewing the pre-war period as anything other than a precursor to the war.
Whenever you read anything about the period, you're reading very decidedly about the pre-war period, as in about what leads to the war.
Yes.
Now, of course, the war was the great catastrophe of the century, and insofar it is, of course, very relevant. But on the other hand, it leads you, of course, to a very shortened, or shall we say, a very narrowed perspective. You only see certain colors in the spectrum, because everything that does not happen to contribute to the war is necessarily disregarded. And when you look at the period, and you, for once, don't look for the reasons of the war. That's why I have this conceit at the beginning of the book, to say, let's just imagine that a plague of bookworms had consumed all information about the time between 1914 and 2000. Of course, that's impossible. It's just an intellectual game. But it does give you a sort of perspective where you don't think, now, what could have kicked off this catastrophe, but you just see, now, what was going on at the time. And then you find, for instance, I think the single most important thing that that perspective liberates and allows you to see is the, shall we say, the sexual revolution of the time. The great change in the situation and the position of women, and also in the attitudes and the expectations of women, and the male reactions to that. Now, that is something that has something to do perhaps with the war, in as far as you can interpret the militarism as a partial reaction to that. But on the other hand, all the very brilliant feminist authors at the time who were writing and who were already formulating arguments that come back in the 1970s, that come back with people like Germaine Greer, they simply don't get a look in most historical accounts because it's seen as not relevant to the question that people are asking. So I thought, if I start by asking a different question, perhaps I'll get a different answer. And I think I did.
Yes, and so the war really is one lens, but it's only one lens amongst many.
You know, it is always, the past always looks logical in retrospect. We never know what the hell will happen tomorrow. But when we look at our lives, they look in most cases like logical sequences of events. I mean, if somebody's had a terrible car crash, that will throw him or her out of their lives. But normally we sort of see our lives as logical sequences of events, despite the fact that we can also see that key moments in our lives were complete chance. What we do professionally, whom we've met, whom we're with, those things are complete chance. And, you know, very often personal history and macro history obey to more or less the same rules. And in retrospect, this war seems the necessary consequence of all sorts of developments at that time. But I think you can make just as strong a case, and to my mind even stronger a case, that actually that war was a tragic, tragic accident, that it happened at all. I mean, yes, of course there were things leading to it, but imagine the Cuban Missile Crisis had become a Third World War.
Yes.
Historians would say, yes, of course, there was a logical sequence of events that led to it, and boom. In fact, there were stronger, more threatening military incidents and international crises in the years preceding 1914. Nobody thought this Archduke was particularly important, but partly for as pedestrian a reason as that it was the summer holidays and key diplomats were very difficult to reach. These events took a dynamic of their own, and once the huge machine was set in motion, it was very difficult to stop. But I think we can just as well imagine a history in which, after this crisis of 1914 that was resolved by diplomatic means, like the Balkan Crisis in 1913, like the Morocco incident in 1912, and then there would have been a crisis in 1915 and perhaps one in 1917, and then the historical moment would have passed, the dynamics would have changed, and things might have happened very differently. Of course, we're not in the business of counter-history, but it is, I think, important not to think that history is an inevitable sequence of events that can only ever lead in one direction. And I just wanted to give this time to liberate this time from the determinist perspective with which it is often seen.
Now, having renounced, as it were, that teleological reading of history, you nonetheless decided to structure the book by writing about each of the years leading up to 1914 and clustering themes around those years. Tell me about why you decided to structure it in that way.
I wanted a way of telling this story, a way of building this panorama that had a strong narrative element in it, that allowed me to tell a story. I simply thought that if I concentrated on the five great powers of the time, Germany, Britain, France, Habsburg, and Russia, and if I would find events that were in some way emblematic for some aspect of the historical developments of that time, then I could tell the story around these events, which could serve as a sort of historical keyhole to let people into a particular aspect of the time.
One word, Philipp, which seems to run through the entire book as an abiding concern of the people you write about, is anxiety. There are manifold forms of anxiety about degeneration, about morals, about birth rate, about masculinity, about empire, all sorts of things. And I wondered, did you see that as the sort of leitmotif as you were writing the book?
Again, if you talk about modernity, where does that start? You can make a very good case for the Renaissance or the Enlightenment or indeed ancient Greece. But this is really, it is a sort of white water moment of history where history accelerates phenomenally, where developments, it's not a time particularly where great inventions are all of a sudden made that will change history, but it is a time when these great inventions begin to grip millions, when industrialization, commercialization, globalization begin to be the reality of people's everyday lives. And that means that simply the world people lived in, changed phenomenally. It was a time in which there were cities that doubled in size in this time. You know, you grew up in a smallish city, and as I once made the calculus that to sort of show you the phenomenal change in the world. Somebody whose grandparents had still lived in the Ancien Regime before the French Revolution could have had grandchildren who saw the Vietnam War. And, you know, this is really this sort of the time at the cusp of these changes. And it is a time in which there's phenomenally strong change, and therefore there was a degree of vertigo, of a feeling of lacking orientation, of uncertainty. And uncertainty, vertigo, can be very exhilarating, as indeed it was for many people who had new opportunities to lead their lives, to determine their lives for artists. But it can also be very frightening. And I think you find both aspects of that in this time.